For 5 years, I shrank myself to fit into my husband's shadow, while my sister Chloe stole every spotlight my family ever built. But at Chloe's lavish engagement party, in front of 200 guests, my husband grabbed the microphone and called me an embarrassing, underachieving anchor around his neck. He thought he was securing his place in my family's elite circle, completely unaware that my grandfather was sitting at table 4, holding a legal document that was about to turn my entire bloodline into a cautionary tale. Before we get into the details of that night, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I always want to know where you are when you're listening. My name is Clara. I'm 31 years old, and for the vast majority of my life, I was the invisible daughter in a family that worshipped visibility. The Sterling family of Greenwich, Connecticut, operated on a very specific currency: optics, achievements, and the relentless pursuit of social elevation. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Sterling, were the architects of this exhausting existence. My father was a senior partner at a corporate law firm. My mother sat on the board of 3 different charitable foundations, though she cared far less about the charities than she did about the galas they hosted. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was 4 years younger than me, but in the hierarchy of the Sterling household, she was the undisputed matriarch of our generation. She was the golden child, the one who emerged from the womb with perfect posture and a terrifyingly sharp instinct for what people wanted to hear. She was varsity tennis captain, Ivy League bound, and eventually a high-powered public relations executive who curated her life like a museum exhibit. I was none of those things. I was quiet, introverted, and possessed a deeply inconvenient passion for things that took too much time and yielded too little prestige. I was a horologist. I restored antique clocks and vintage watches. I spent my days in a small, dusty workshop with a magnifying loupe over my eye, using tweezers to set microscopic gears back into perfect alignment. To me, it was poetry. To my family, it was a hobby that had tragically mutated into a career. Clara tinkers, my mother would say to her friends at dinner parties, swirling her Chardonnay with a tight, apologetic smile. We're hoping she'll eventually transition into gallery management, something with a bit more polish. I didn't care about polish. I just wanted peace, and for a brief, foolish period of my life, I thought I had found it with Mark. I met Mark when I was 25. He was a junior vice president at a private wealth management firm, 30 years old, driven, and impeccably dressed. In the beginning, he seemed fascinated by my quiet world. He would come to my workshop, lean against the doorframe, and watch me work, telling me he loved how grounded I was. He said I was the antidote to the corporate sharks he swam with all day. We married a year later. My parents approved of him instantly. How could they not? Mark spoke their language. He understood golf handicaps, offshore tax brackets, and the exact right moment to laugh at my father's dry jokes. But the moment the ink on our marriage license dried, the mask began to slip. Mark didn't want a grounded wife. He wanted a supporting actress. It started with small, insidious comments. I'd come home from the workshop with grease under my fingernails, and he'd sigh, looking at my hands as if I'd just dragged a dead animal into our pristine kitchen. Then it escalated to my wardrobe. He started replacing my comfortable sweaters with tailored, restrictive dresses, telling me I needed to look the part of a wealth manager's wife. By our 3rd year of marriage, Mark had seamlessly integrated himself into the Sterling family dynamic, which meant he joined them in treating me like an adorable, mildly embarrassing disappointment. At family dinners, Mark and Chloe would sit across from each other, trading aggressive banter about market trends and PR campaigns, while I sat at the end of the table, silently moving peas around my plate. If I ever tried to join the conversation, Mark would reach over, pat my hand condescendingly, and say something like, "Let's not bore Clara with the heavy lifting. How are your little clocks doing, sweetheart?" My parents would chuckle, Chloe would smirk, and I would swallow the humiliation, convinced that this was just what marriage was: a series of compromises where you slowly traded pieces of yourself for companionship. But there was one person in the Sterling family who didn't view me as a failure. My grandfather, Arthur. Arthur was my father's father. He was 82 years old, lived in a sprawling, drafty stone estate on the edge of town, and was the sole architect of the Sterling family fortune. He had made his money in commercial shipping in the 1970s, back when wealth was built with steel and sweat, not algorithms and venture capital. To my parents and Chloe, Arthur was a wealthy inconvenience. They viewed him as a senile, eccentric old man who needed to be placated just enough to ensure they remained in his will. The Sterling estate was estimated to be worth around $120 million. My father, Richard, was practically vibrating with anticipation for the day he would inherit the holding company. But they never actually visited him. They sent him generic holiday cards and called him on his birthday, usually placing him on speakerphone so they could all yell their greetings and hang up within 3 minutes. I was the only one who visited. Every Sunday afternoon, rain or shine, I drove out to Arthur's estate. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Arthur shared my love for mechanics. He had a massive collection of vintage pocket watches, and we would sit in his sunroom for hours, the air smelling of brass polish and old paper, taking apart complex movements and bringing them back to life. "You have good hands, Clara," he told me once, his gravelly voice breaking a 2-hour silence. "Patient hands. Your father has grasping hands. Your sister has taking hands. And your husband—" He paused, carefully setting a mainspring into place. "Your husband has empty hands. He just dresses them up in expensive gloves." I defended Mark that day. I told Arthur that Mark was just stressed, that the financial sector was demanding, that he really did love me in his own way. Arthur just looked at me over the rims of his reading glasses. His eyes were pale blue, sharp as shattered glass. "A man who loves you doesn't require you to be small so he can feel tall, Clara. Remember that." I didn't fully understand the weight of Arthur's words until October of 2023, the month the Sterling family illusion shattered permanently. It started when Chloe announced her engagement. She had been dating Julian, a 33-year-old tech entrepreneur whose cryptocurrency trading platform had just gone public. Julian was loud, brash, and incredibly wealthy. To my parents, he was the holy grail of sons-in-law. The engagement announcement wasn't just a family event, it was a PR campaign. Chloe posted a meticulously edited video of the proposal in Santorini, complete with drone footage and a sponsored tag for the jewelry designer who crafted her 5-carat diamond ring. My mother immediately swung into action, planning an engagement party that rivaled a royal coronation. It was to be held at the Greenwich Country Club, a sit-down dinner for 200 of the most influential people in their social orbit. For Mark, this engagement party was the Super Bowl. He was desperate to get his hooks into Julian. Julian's new tech fortune was exactly the kind of portfolio Mark needed to make senior partner at his wealth management firm. For weeks leading up to the party, Mark was a manic, obsessive nightmare. He spent hours researching Julian's business, rehearsing conversation starters in the mirror, and curating his outfit down to the thread count of his pocket square. And, true to form, his anxiety manifested as cruelty toward me. 3 days before the event, Mark walked into our bedroom and tossed a heavy, black garment bag onto the mattress. I was sitting at my vanity, carefully applying a solvent to a rusted gear I had brought home from the shop. Mark stared at my hands, his jaw tightening so hard I could see a muscle jumping beneath his cheekbone. He unzipped the bag, pulling out a suffocatingly tight, emerald green silk dress. It wasn't my style. It was loud, restrictive, and cut so low it felt like a costume designed for someone else's life. "Wear this," he commanded, his voice clipped and hollow, "and get a manicure. I cannot have you shaking hands with Julian's investors looking like a chimney sweep. This is the most important networking night of my career, Clara. Do not embarrass me. Just stand there, smile, and for the love of God, don't talk about old clocks." I looked at the dress, the shiny, synthetic manifestation of everything Mark wanted me to be, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I didn't argue. I had long ago learned that arguing with Mark was like trying to punch a river. He would simply flow around my resistance and drown me in his relentless current of disappointment. The night of the engagement party arrived with a suffocating humidity that clung to the Connecticut air. The Greenwich Country Club had been transformed into an ostentatious temple of wealth. Towering arrangements of white orchids dominated every surface. A string quartet played contemporary pop songs in the corner, and waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with trays of Dom Perignon and caviar blinis. When Mark and I walked through the double mahogany doors, he instantly let go of my arm. His eyes darted around the room, scanning the crowd with the predatory hunger of a starving animal. The moment he spotted Julian, who was holding court near the ice sculpture with a circle of venture capitalists, Mark's posture changed. He stood taller, his smile stretched into something painfully artificial, and he vanished into the crowd without a backward glance. I was left alone near the entrance, pulling nervously at the emerald silk that pinched my ribs. I found my seating card. I was placed at table 4. In the geography of the Sterling family, the head table was the sun, and the surrounding tables were ranked strictly by social utility. Table 4 was the outer rim of the solar system. It was the table reserved for distant, unhelpful relatives, elderly aunts who couldn't hear the speeches, and, apparently, me. Mark, I noticed, had managed to maneuver his seating assignment to Table 2, directly adjacent to Chloe and Julian. I didn't mind Table 4. In fact, I felt a profound sense of relief as I sat down in the dimly lit corner of the ballroom. But that relief turned into genuine joy when the chair next to me was pulled out, and my grandfather Arthur sat down. Arthur rarely attended these functions. He despised the country club, despised the forced networking, and had a particular distaste for the way my mother fawned over anyone with a net worth higher than her own. Yet, here he was, wearing a perfectly tailored vintage tweed suit, leaning heavily on a silver-handled cane. His pale blue eyes swept over the ballroom, taking in the spectacle with a look of quiet, unyielding disgust. "Grandpa," I breathed, genuinely shocked. "You came." Arthur turned to me, his expression softening instantly. He reached out and covered my hand with his. His skin was paper-thin, tracing the map of a long, hard-fought life. "I wouldn't miss this, Clara," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely carried over the string quartet. "I needed to see it for myself." "See what?" I asked. Arthur didn't answer immediately. He looked across the room to where my father was aggressively clapping Julian on the shoulder, and where Mark was hovering at the edge of the circle, laughing too loud at a joke Julian had just made. Arthur's grip on my hand tightened slightly. "Time reveals everything, Clara," he murmured, sounding more like a prophet than a retired shipping magnate. "Especially the cheap metal. The gears always grind when the alignment is forced." I didn't know what he meant, and I didn't get the chance to ask. The chimes rang out, signaling the guests to take their seats for the dinner service. As the evening progressed, the tension in the room began to coil tighter. From my vantage point at Table 4, I had a perfect view of Mark's unraveling. He was trying desperately to engage Julian in conversation, but Julian was the kind of man who only paid attention to people who could do something for him. Julian kept looking past Mark, giving him curt, one-word answers, and turning his back to speak to my father. I watched Mark consume 3 glasses of whiskey in rapid succession. I watched his face grow flushed, his smile turning brittle and desperate. He was failing. The grand networking opportunity he had obsessively planned was dissolving into nothing, and I knew, with the terrifying certainty of a battered spouse, that I was going to pay the price for his humiliation the moment we got in the car to go home. Then came the toasts. My father went first. He stood at the head table, microphone in hand, and delivered a speech that was essentially a financial prospectus disguised as a father's blessing. He praised Chloe's perfection, her drive, her pristine image. He praised Julian's disruptive genius. He talked about legacy, about the merging of 2 great dynasties. He didn't mention me once. I was used to it. It didn't even sting anymore. Julian spoke next, delivering a slick, rehearsed monologue about synergy and future returns, treating his marriage to my sister like a corporate merger. The crowd ate it up, laughing and applauding on cue. And then, before the MC could reclaim the microphone to announce dessert, Mark stood up. He didn't have permission to speak. He wasn't on the schedule. But the alcohol and the suffocating desperation to be seen had pushed him over the edge. He grabbed the microphone from the stand, tapping it loudly. The feedback squealed, causing several guests to wince. A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the ballroom of 200 people. If I could just say a few words." Mark slurred slightly, his eyes glassy under the chandelier lights. He swayed on his feet, gripping the microphone like a lifeline. My mother's face froze in a mask of sheer panic. Chloe raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "You know, when I married into the Sterling family, I knew I was joining a legacy of winners," Mark began, his voice booming through the speakers. He pointed a finger at Julian. "Julian, man, you are a visionary. You get it. You know what it takes to build an empire. And Chloe," he turned to my sister, offering a sloppy, dramatic bow, "you are the crown jewel. You are perfection. You two are going to rule the world." The crowd offered a polite, scattered applause. Mark should have stopped there. He should have sat down. But a narcissist denied attention is a dangerous thing, and Mark needed the room to look at him, to laugh with him, to validate his existence. To do that, he needed a punchline. And in Mark's world, I was always the punchline. "It's intimidating, honestly," Mark continued, pacing slowly behind the head table. "Being surrounded by all this ambition, it makes you realize where the dead weight is. My stomach dropped. A cold, paralyzing dread washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. Mark turned his gaze across the room, searching the tables until his eyes locked onto me, sitting in the dark corner at table 4. He raised his free hand and pointed directly at me. 200 heads turned, following his finger. "I mean, look at my Clara," Mark said, laughing into the microphone. It was a cruel, sharp sound that echoed off the high ceilings. "We can't all be superstars like Chloe. Some of us are content to just sit in a dusty basement, playing with broken gears and old clocks. It's embarrassing, really. I bring her to these things, and I have to pray she doesn't start talking about 19th century springs and sprockets while the adults are discussing real business." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the kind of silence that rings in your ears, the kind that feels like a physical pressure on your chest. "She's my little underachieving anchor," Mark declared, grinning widely, completely oblivious to the horror radiating from the guests. He thought he was being charming. He thought he was aligning himself with the winners by stepping on my neck. "She drags me down, but hey, every yacht needs an anchor, right? Even if it's a bit of a joke. Cheers to the real winners tonight, Chloe and Julian." Mark raised his whiskey glass. A few people, Julian's tech bro friends, chuckled uncomfortably. Chloe smirked, taking a slow sip of her champagne, looking at me with undisguised pity. My mother simply looked away, staring fixedly at the floral centerpiece as if I had ceased to exist. My father leaned over and whispered something to Julian, completely ignoring the public execution of his eldest daughter. I couldn't breathe. The emerald silk dress felt like a vice crushing my ribs. The humiliation was so profound, so absolute, that it transcended embarrassment and became a physical agony. My vision blurred. I wanted the floor to open up and swallow me. I wanted to disappear into the dust of my workshop and never come out. I sat frozen, staring at my hands in my lap, feeling the collective gaze of 200 people pitying the pathetic, invisible sister and her cruel, desperate husband. But then, a sound cut through the suffocating silence. Clack. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound, wood striking marble. Clack, clack, clack. I turned my head slowly. Next to me, Grandpa Arthur was rising from his chair. He was pushing himself up, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane. The sound was his cane striking the polished marble floor as he stepped away from table 4. He didn't move fast, but there was a terrifying magnetic gravity to his movements. Every eye in the room shifted from me to the 82-year-old patriarch of the Sterling family. Arthur stopped in the center of the aisle. He didn't ask for a microphone. He didn't need one. When Arthur Sterling spoke, the world held its breath. "An anchor," Arthur said. His voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a resonant, granite-like quality that carried to every corner of the vast ballroom. It cut through the ambient hum of the air conditioning and the uneasy shifting of 200 guests. It was a voice that had commanded boardrooms, crushed competitors, and built an empire from salt water and rust. Mark, still standing near the head table, lowered his whiskey glass. The foolish, arrogant grin faltered, replaced by a twitch of uncertainty. Yes, sir. Just a little joke." Arthur did not smile. He did not look at Mark. He looked at my father, Richard, who was suddenly sitting very straight, his knuckles white around his water goblet. He looked at my mother, whose face had drained of all color, the pristine facade cracking under the weight of Arthur's pale, unblinking stare. Finally, he looked at Chloe, whose smug expression had vanished, replaced by the instinctual fear of a child caught stealing. Arthur began to walk toward the head table. Clack, clack, clack. The sound of his cane was the only noise in the room. He bypassed the terrified waiters, bypassed the ice sculpture, and stopped 10 feet away from where Mark stood trembling. "A joke," Arthur repeated, tasting the word as if it were poison. "You stand before my family, my guests, and you publicly humiliate my granddaughter. You call her an embarrassment. You call her an anchor. You think this makes you look strong, boy." Arthur spat the word boy with such venom that Mark physically flinched. I was just commending Julian," Mark stammered, his bravado dissolving into a pathetic alcohol-soaked puddle, just highlighting the ambition in the room. "You know nothing of ambition," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with a cold, controlled fury. "You know nothing of value. You are a parasite, Mark. You attached yourself to my family because you are too weak to build anything of your own. You wear expensive suits to hide the fact that you are fundamentally, irreversibly cheap." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. My mother half rose from her chair. "Arthur, please, this is Chloe's night." "Sit down, Eleanor," Arthur commanded without looking at her. My mother dropped back into her chair as if she had been shot. Arthur turned his gaze back to Mark, who was now sweating profusely, the microphone hanging limply by his side. "You think Clara's work is embarrassing?" Arthur asked. "You think fixing broken things, understanding how complex systems operate, having the patience to restore what others throw away, you think that is a joke?" Arthur reached into the inside pocket of his tweed jacket. The movement was slow, deliberate. He pulled out a thick, folded document bound in a blue legal backer. It bore the heavy, embossed seal of his personal law firm. "Let me tell you about the gears of this family, Mark," Arthur said, holding the document up so the light caught the seal. "Because you seem to think you understand how the machine works." "Richard," he barked, finally looking at my father, "what is the valuation of Sterling Holdings as of this morning?" My father swallowed hard, his eyes glued to the blue folder. $122 million, father." "Correct," Arthur said, "and for 20 years, you have operated under the assumption that upon my death, the controlling shares would pass to you, allowing you to liquidate the assets, fund Eleanor's galas, and finance Chloe's lifestyle." The silence in the room was no longer just uncomfortable, it was lethal. Everyone present understood they were witnessing a dynastic execution. "But you see," Arthur continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling, "I have spent the last decade watching you. All of you. I watched you, Richard, treat your eldest daughter as an inconvenience because she didn't fit into a country club brochure. I watched you, Eleanor, prioritize a shiny PR campaign over the quiet, brilliant mind of the child you pushed into a corner. And I watched you, Chloe, steal her light because you are too hollow to generate your own." Chloe let out a small, strangled sob. Julian shifted uncomfortably, suddenly looking like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Arthur turned back to Mark. "But mostly, I watched you, Mark. I watched you belittle my granddaughter to make yourself feel important. I watched you try to crush the only genuine soul in this bloodline." Arthur tapped the blue document against his cane. 2 weeks ago, Arthur said, his voice ringing with absolute authority, "I restructured the Sterling family trust. I dissolved the planned inheritance structure. I removed Richard as the primary beneficiary. I removed Chloe entirely." A shockwave hit the room. My mother let out a sharp cry. My father stood up, knocking his chair backward. "Father, you can't be serious. You can't do this." "It is already done," Arthur stated, his eyes blazing with an ancient, uncompromising fire. "The entirety of the controlling shares, the voting rights, the real estate portfolio, and the liquid assets of Sterling Holdings have been placed into an irrevocable trust." Arthur slowly turned around, his gaze finding me in the dark corner at table 4. I was trembling so violently I thought the chair would shatter. "The sole trustee," Arthur announced, his voice carrying a sudden, immense warmth as he looked at me, "with absolute, unchecked authority over the distribution of funds, the sale of assets, and the future of this empire, is Clara." The ballroom erupted. Whispers, gasps, the clinking of dropped silverware. My mother buried her face in her hands. Chloe stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, realizing in a single second that the sister she had mocked her entire life now held the deed to her future. Mark staggered back, bumping into the ice sculpture. He looked at me, then at Arthur, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "Clara?" he whispered, the microphone picking up the terrified tremor in his voice. "Clara gets everything?" "Clara gets everything," Arthur confirmed, his voice hard as iron, "because she is the only one in this room who understands that value is not determined by how loud you shout, but by how carefully you build. She knows how to fix broken things, and God knows, this family is broken." Arthur pointed his cane directly at Mark's chest. "As for you," Arthur growled, "you are not a Sterling, you are a mistake, and I suggest you leave this room before I have security throw you out with the rest of the trash." Mark stood paralyzed for 3 agonizing seconds. He looked around the room, begging silently for someone, anyone, to intervene. But the venture capitalists, the socialites, the country club elite, they all turned their faces away. He was toxic now. He was the man who had just publicly humiliated the new monarch of a $122 million empire. Mark dropped the microphone. It hit the floor with a loud, ringing pop. He turned and practically ran out of the ballroom, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut behind him. The silence rushed back in, heavy and pregnant. Arthur didn't look at my parents. He didn't look at Chloe. He turned his back on the head table, the symbol of everything fake and fragile in our family, and he began the long walk back to table 4. Clack! Clack, clack. He stopped in front of me. I was crying, silent tears spilling over my cheeks, staining the horrific emerald silk dress. I felt entirely exposed, entirely terrified, but for the first time in my 31 years of life, I felt seen. Arthur reached down and offered me his hand. "Come on, Clara," he said gently, ignoring the 200 people staring at us. "Let's go home. I have a 1920s Patek Philippe movement that needs your hands." I took his hand. It was strong, warm, and real. I stood up, leaving my purse, leaving the untouched plate of food, leaving the ruins of my parents' carefully constructed illusion. As I walked out of that ballroom, my arm linked through my grandfather's, I didn't look back at the head table. I didn't need to. The anchor had been cut, and I was finally free to move. The drive back to Arthur's estate was entirely silent. The heavy tires of his vintage Bentley absorbed the imperfections of the Connecticut roads, creating a cocoon of leather-scented quiet. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the dark silhouettes of the trees blurred past, my mind struggling to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. The emerald silk dress, which only an hour ago felt like a cage, now felt like a relic from a past life I was already shedding. When we arrived at the estate, Arthur didn't lead me to the grand living room or the formal dining hall. He led me straight to the sunroom, our sanctuary. He switched on the brass desk lamps, casting a warm golden glow over the workbenches covered in tiny cogs, springs, and half-assembled pocket watches. He moved to a mahogany cabinet, pulled out a bottle of single malt scotch, and poured 2 neat glasses. He handed one to me. I took it with shaking hands. "Drink," he ordered gently. "It helps settle the nerves." I took a sip. It burned down my throat, grounding me in the present moment. I looked at Arthur, who was leaning against his workbench, watching me with an expression of profound calm. "Grandpa," I started, my voice hoarse. "You didn't have to. I don't know anything about running a holding company. I don't know about real estate portfolios or liquid assets. I fix clocks." "Exactly," Arthur said, taking a sip of his scotch. "You understand mechanics. You understand cause and effect. You understand that if one gear is stripped, the whole system fails. Running an empire is no different, Clara. It just requires a larger magnifying loop." He set his glass down and walked over to me, placing his hands on my shoulders. "I didn't do this to punish your father, though God knows he earned it. I did this to protect the legacy I built from people who only know how to consume. Your father would have bled the company dry to fund his status. Chloe would have leveraged it for fame. And your husband would have sold you out for a promotion." At the mention of Mark, a fresh wave of nausea hit me. "Mark," I whispered. "What am I going to do about Mark?" Arthur's eyes hardened. "You are going to do what any competent horologist does when they find a rusted, useless part inside a beautiful machine. You are going to extract it, throw it in the trash, and never think about it again." He walked over to a side table and picked up a manila folder, handing it to me. "I took the liberty of having my attorneys draft divorce papers 3 days ago. Irreconcilable differences. Full separation of assets. Since he humiliated you publicly, I also included a non-disclosure agreement regarding the trust. If he signs it quietly, he walks away with the clothes on his back and his miserable little job. If he fights it, my legal team will bury him so deep in litigation, he won't be able to afford a bus ticket out of Greenwich." I stared at the folder. It felt heavy in my hands. The speed of it all was dizzying, but beneath the shock, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years: autonomy. "Stay here tonight," Arthur said, reading my exhaustion. "We'll deal with the fallout tomorrow. The gears are in motion, Clara. Now, you just have to let them turn." I slept in the guest room that night, wrapped in heavy quilts, the ticking of a dozen antique grandfather clocks lulling me into a deep, dreamless sleep. The fallout, as Arthur predicted, was immediate and spectacular. When I turned my phone on the next morning, it practically vibrated off the nightstand. I had 47 missed calls, 112 text messages, and a dozen voicemails. The first voicemail was from Mark. It was frantic, breathless, and pathetic. "Clara, please. Clara, pick up. I was drunk, okay? It was a joke that went bad. I love you. You know I love you. We need to talk about this. This trust thing. Don't do anything crazy. Just come home. Please." I deleted it without listening to the end. The next voicemail was from my mother. Her tone was a terrifying mixture of forced sweetness and barely concealed panic. "Clara, darling, where did you and Arthur run off to? We need to have a family meeting. The optics of last night were..." Complicated. Your father is very upset. We need to sit down and figure out how to undo whatever nonsense Arthur thinks he's put on paper. Call me immediately. I deleted that one too. Then came Chloe's text. You ruined my engagement party. Julian's investors left early. Are you happy now? You've always been jealous of me, and now you've manipulated Grandpa into this psychotic stunt. Fix it. I didn't respond. I simply blocked her number. Then I blocked my mother, then my father, and finally, Mark. I walked downstairs to find Arthur drinking black coffee and reading the Financial Times. He looked up, noted the resolute set of my jaw, and smiled a grim, approving smile. My legal team is waiting in the library, he said, folding the newspaper. It's time to go to work. The next 6 months were a blur of legal briefings, financial audits, and the systematic dismantling of my previous life. Arthur's lawyers were ruthless and highly efficient. When Mark received the divorce papers, he initially tried to fight, hiring a loud, aggressive attorney who threatened to claim half of my newfound trust. Arthur's lead counsel simply sent Mark's attorney a dossier containing evidence of Mark's financial mismanagement at his own firm discrepancies. Arthur's private investigators had quietly gathered over the past year. It was a subtle, elegant threat. The message was clear: sign the papers, or we ruin your career. Mark signed the papers the next day. The divorce was finalized in record time. I never saw him again. My parents were a more complicated problem. They couldn't sue me because the trust was ironclad. Instead, they tried emotional extortion. They showed up at Arthur's estate unannounced. They sent letters. They tried to use mutual family friends to guilt me into surrendering control. I didn't engage. With Arthur's guidance, I took over the management of Sterling Holdings. I learned to read balance sheets. I sat in boardrooms, and I began making decisions. My first major action as trustee was to slash my parents' exorbitant monthly allowance by 70%. When my father called, furious, threatening to disown me, I answered the phone myself. You can't disown the person who owns the house you live in, Dad, I said calmly, leaning back in the leather chair of Arthur's home office. You have enough to live comfortably, but the galas, the country club dues, the extravagant vacations, those are over. You're going to have to learn to live within a budget. I hung up before he could respond. It felt incredible. As for Chloe, Julian's venture capitalists weren't just spooked by the family drama at the engagement party. They were spooked by the sudden realization that Julian was marrying into a family that no longer had access to the Sterling capital. Without my father's guaranteed inheritance to backstop Julian's tech ventures, Julian's appeal diminished significantly. 3 months after the engagement party, Julian broke off the engagement. He cited incompatible long-term visions, but everyone in Greenwich knew the truth. Chloe's stock had plummeted, and Julian was cutting his losses. Chloe moved back in with our parents, her PR career stalling as the socialites who used to flock to her suddenly found her presence inconvenient. One afternoon in late April, I was sitting in my workshop, which I had expanded into a massive sunlit studio on the grounds of Arthur's estate. I was carefully cleaning the escapement mechanism of an 18th-century French carriage clock. The door clicked open, and Arthur walked in, leaning on his cane. He looked frailer than he had 6 months ago, the winter having taken a toll on his lungs, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. You're doing good work, Clara, he said, not looking at the clock, but at me, with the company. You secured that real estate deal in Boston. Clean, efficient, no wasted movements. I'm just applying what you taught me, Grandpa, I said, setting down my tweezers and taking off my magnifying loupe, making sure the gears align. Arthur nodded slowly. He walked over and sat down in the armchair near the window, looking out at the sprawling green lawns of the estate. There is a difference between understanding how the gears align and having the courage to let them turn, Arthur said quietly, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. You've shown courage, Clara, more than your father ever possessed, more than Mark could even comprehend. He paused, a raspy cough rattling his chest before he continued. I won't be here much longer. We both know that. The doctors have their charts and their timelines, but a man knows when his mainspring is winding down. I felt a sudden, sharp ache in my throat. I stood up from my workbench and walked over to him, sitting on the edge of the ottoman near his chair. I took his frail, weathered hand in mine. Don't talk like that, I whispered, though I knew he was right. Over the past few weeks, his energy had waned. The vibrant, commanding presence that had silenced a ballroom of 200 people was beginning to dim, replaced by a quiet, reflective stillness. It's just the mechanics of life, Clara, he smiled, a gentle, understanding curve of his lips. Everything has a cycle. My cycle was building this empire. Your cycle is deciding what it means. He squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. I gave you the power because I knew you wouldn't be consumed by it. Wealth is a corrosive acid to those who lack a strong container. Your parents, your sister, they had no container. They let the acid eat through their character until nothing was left but the performance. You, my dear, are forged from stronger metal. Arthur leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment as if the effort of speaking had drained him. Tomorrow, he said softly, you have a meeting with the board regarding the expansion into sustainable development. Don't let Henderson push you on the timeline. He's impatient. He mistakes speed for efficiency. Remind him that a clock built in a day will lose an hour by the week's end. I smiled, a tear slipping down my cheek. I will, Grandpa. I promise. Arthur passed away peacefully 2 weeks later in his sleep. The funeral was a massive affair, heavily attended by the titans of industry, politicians, and the upper crust of Connecticut society. My parents were there, dressed in impeccable mourning attire, trying desperately to project the image of the grieving dynasty. Chloe stood beside them, looking pale and subdued, the loss of her engagement and her status visibly weighing on her. I sat in the front row, wearing a simple black dress, not the restrictive emerald silk of my past, but something comfortable, something that belonged to me. I didn't cry during the service. I had done my crying in the quiet hours of the morning, sitting at his workbench, holding the carriage clock we had finished restoring together. After the burial, there was a reception at the estate. I stood near the grand fireplace, accepting condolences from people whose names I barely knew but whose faces I recognized from Arthur's files. Eventually, my father approached me. He looked older, the stress of the past 6 months having carved deep lines into his face. He held a glass of bourbon, his knuckles white around the crystal. He really did it, Richard said, his voice a low, bitter murmur. He really gave it all to you. He did, I replied evenly, not stepping back, not shrinking. You know you can't run this alone, Clara, my father said, attempting to muster the old, condescending authority he used to wield over me. The board will eat you alive. You need guidance. You need someone who understands the landscape. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw exactly what Arthur had seen. Grasping hands. I have guidance, Dad, I said, my voice calm and steady. I have the best legal and financial advisors in the country, and more importantly, I have patience. I know how to watch the board. I know how to see who is pulling which lever. I don't need you to navigate the landscape. I own the landscape. My father's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to argue, to demand, to belittle, but the words died in his throat. He looked into my eyes and realized the quiet, invisible daughter he had ignored for 3 decades was gone. In her place stood the sole trustee of the Sterling legacy, a woman who held his financial survival in the palm of her hand. He offered a stiff, awkward nod, turned on his heel, and walked away. Over the next year, I transformed Sterling Holdings. I fired the dead weight on the board the sycophants my father had cultivated and replaced them with sharp, forward-thinking executives who valued sustainable growth over immediate, flashy returns. We diversified the portfolio, investing heavily in green technology and urban revitalization projects. I didn't become a socialite. I didn't start attending the galas my mother cherished. I kept my life quiet. I stayed in Arthur's estate, maintaining the sunroom exactly as he left it. I still spent my evenings restoring antique clocks, finding peace in the predictable, logical rhythm of the gears. One evening in late November, the first snow of the season was falling, dusting the vast lawns of the estate in a pristine white coat. I was sitting in the library, reviewing a merger acquisition file, when my assistant Sarah knocked softly on the oak door. "Excuse me, Miss Sterling," Sarah said, stepping into the room. "There's a woman at the front gate. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says she's your sister. She's asking for a few minutes of your time." I paused, my pen hovering over the document. I hadn't spoken to Chloe since the engagement party, over a year ago. She had sent a few emails, mostly demanding reinstatements of her allowance, which I had ignored. "Let her in," I said softly, closing the file. "Bring her to the drawing room." 10 minutes later, I walked into the drawing room. Chloe was standing near the window, looking out at the snow. She looked vastly different from the polished, arrogant woman who had smirked at me while my husband humiliated me. The designer clothes were replaced by a simple wool coat. Her hair wasn't perfectly styled. She looked tired. She looked human. She turned when she heard my footsteps. Clara, she said, her voice lacking its usual sharp edge. Chloe, I replied, gesturing to a velvet armchair. Sit down. She sat, keeping her coat on, gripping her handbag tightly in her lap. I'll get right to the point, she said, taking a deep breath. I need a job. I raised an eyebrow. A job? What happened to your PR firm? Chloe looked down at her hands. When Julian left, it wasn't just a breakup. It was a massive hit to my professional credibility. My clients wanted proximity to his network, to our family's capital. When the capital vanished, so did the clients. My partner bought me out last month for pennies. I'm practically broke. She looked up at me, her eyes defensive but desperate. Mom and Dad can't help me. You cut them off too severely. They're selling the Hamptons house just to cover their property taxes in Greenwich. I am aware of our parents' financial situation, I said neutrally. I am the one who structured their stipend. Right, Chloe said bitterly. So, you've won. You have all the power, all the money, and we're all begging for scraps. Is this what you wanted, Clara? Revenge? I leaned back in my chair, looking at the sister who had spent her entire life trying to extinguish my light. This isn't revenge, Chloe, I said quietly. Revenge would be me showing up at your lowest moment, grabbing a microphone, and calling you an embarrassment in front of 200 people. Chloe flinched, the color draining from her face. She looked away, staring into the unlit fireplace. I don't want revenge, I continued. I just wanted to be left alone to do my work. You all forced this dynamic when you mistook my quietness for weakness. So, what? Chloe asked, her voice trembling slightly. You're just going to let me go bankrupt? No, I said. Chloe looked back at me, surprise flickering in her eyes. You're a sterling, I said, and despite everything, I won't see you ruined. But you are not getting a blank check, and you are not getting a vanity position at the holding company. I stood up and walked over to a side table, picking up a sleek grey folder. I handed it to her. This is a contract, I explained as she opened it. I recently acquired a mid-sized logistics firm in Chicago. They need a complete rebranding and internal communications overhaul. It's not glamorous. It's supply chain management, warehousing, and freight. But it's solid, honest work. Chloe stared at the document, reading the details. The salary is fair, I continued. Not extravagant, but enough to live comfortably. You will report to the regional director, not to me. You will have to relocate to Chicago. If you perform well, you'll earn your bonuses. If you fail, you will be fired, just like any other employee. No safety nets, no sterling privilege. Chloe closed the folder, looking at me with a mixture of disbelief and resentment. Chicago. You want to exile me to Chicago to do PR for a trucking company. I am offering you an opportunity to build something of your own, I corrected her. Something that doesn't rely on Dad's name or a tech billionaire's ring. You can take it, or you can walk out that door and figure it out yourself. The choice is yours. Chloe sat in silence for a long time, the grey folder resting heavily on her lap. The grand drawing room of Arthur's estate, with its towering bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains, seemed to press in on her, a stark reminder of the power dynamic that had irreversibly shifted. I watched the conflict play out across her face, the pride warring with the desperate reality of her situation. For 27 years, Chloe had never had to choose. She simply took what was offered, assuming it was her birthright. Now, she was being asked to earn it, in a city 1,000 miles away from the social circles that had defined her existence. Finally, she let out a slow, shuddering breath. Her shoulders slumped, the last vestiges of her manufactured arrogance falling away. I'll take it, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Good, I replied, my tone remaining strictly professional. Human Resources will reach out to you on Monday with the relocation package and onboarding details. I expect you to be in Chicago by the 1st of the month. Chloe nodded slowly, standing up. She clutched the folder to her chest, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. It's strange, she murmured, almost to herself. I used to think you were the weak one because you never fought back. I never fought back because I knew the game you were all playing was rigged, I said quietly. I didn't want to win your game, Chloe. I just wanted to build my own. She looked at me, a complex emotion flickering in her eyes, something that looked dangerously close to respect. She didn't say thank you. I didn't expect her to. But as she walked out of the drawing room, her posture was different. She wasn't carrying the weight of a golden child anymore. She was just a woman, carrying a folder, walking out into the snow to start over. The following spring brought a quiet, steady rhythm to my life, Sterling Holdings was thriving under the new direction. The sustainable development initiatives were yielding significant returns, proving to the board that ethical investment could be highly profitable. I was busy, but it was a fulfilling, purposeful kind of busy. And then, Mark resurfaced. I was at a charity gala in Manhattan, one of the few I attended, specifically because it benefited a foundation providing technical education for underprivileged youth. I was wearing a tailored navy suit, speaking with the foundation's director, when I felt a hand brush my arm. I turned and saw him. Mark looked awful. The sharp, expensive veneer had completely eroded. His suit was slightly rumpled, his hair thinning, and the aggressive confidence that used to radiate from him was replaced by a nervous, twitchy energy. He looked like a man who had been running a marathon he was fundamentally unequipped to finish. "Clara," he said, offering a weak, ingratiating smile. I didn't step back. I didn't flinch. I simply looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no fear, no residual affection, just a profound, clinical indifference. "Mark," I acknowledged, my voice flat. You look incredible," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the caliber of the people surrounding me. "I've been reading about what you're doing with Sterling Holdings. The Boston acquisition was brilliant, really top-tier strategy." "What do you want, Mark?" I asked, cutting through the sycophancy. He swallowed hard, rubbing the back of his neck. I lost my job at the firm, Clara, 6 months ago. They said it was a restructuring, but I know your grandfather's lawyers had something to do with it. I've been blacklisted. I can't get an interview anywhere in the tri-state area." I stared at him. He was actually asking me for help. The sheer audacity of it was almost impressive. "I was hoping," he continued, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that maybe, given our history, you could make a call, just to clear my name. I know I messed up, Clara. I know that night at the engagement party was a disaster, but I was under so much pressure. You have to understand that." "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice cold and clear, easily cutting through the ambient noise of the gala. "You were under pressure, so you decided to use your wife as a stepping stone. You thought that publicly humiliating me would secure your place among people you deemed important." "I was drunk." "You were honest," I corrected him sharply. "Alcohol didn't create that cruelty, Mark. It just removed the filter. You showed everyone exactly who you are." "Clara, please," he begged, a pathetic whine creeping into his voice. "I have nothing. I'm living in a studio apartment in Queens. You have everything. You have the power to fix this." I looked at the man I had once thought I would spend my life with. I remembered the emerald silk dress. I remembered the suffocating weight of his expectations. I remembered the laughter of the country club elite as he called me an anchor. "You're right," I said softly, stepping closer to him so he could hear every syllable. "I do have the power to fix this, but I won't." His eyes widened in shock. "Clara, you called me an anchor, Mark," I reminded him, my gaze unwavering. "You said I dragged you down. Well, I cut the chain. Now you are free to float on your own. Let's see how well you navigate without me weighing you down." I turned my back on him and walked away. I didn't look back to see his reaction. He was a stripped gear, a rusted spring, an obsolete component that had been removed from the machine of my life. He no longer mattered. Later that night, I returned to Arthur's estate. The house was quiet, the only sound, the steady, rhythmic ticking of the antique clocks that filled the halls. I walked into the sunroom, switching on the brass desk lamp. On my workbench sat a complex, 19th-century chronometer I had been restoring for the past 3 months. It was a beautiful, intricate piece of machinery, but the mainspring had been shattered, and several critical gears were warped. For weeks, I had meticulously cleaned every component, fabricated a new mainspring, and carefully reshaped the warped gears. Now, it was time for the final assembly. I sat down, adjusted my magnifying loupe, and picked up my tweezers. I worked in silence, my breathing steady, my hands completely still. I placed the final gear into the assembly, ensuring the teeth aligned perfectly with the surrounding cogs. I secured the bridge, tightened the microscopic screws, and then, very gently, I wound the mainspring. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. And then, with a soft, resonant click, the balance wheel sprang to life. It began to oscillate rapidly, a heartbeat of brass and steel. The escapement mechanism engaged, producing a sharp, precise tick-tick-tick. The machine was alive again. I sat back, taking off my loupe, and listened to the sound. It was the sound of order, of alignment, of a system functioning exactly as it was designed to. I thought about my family, my father, living quietly in his diminished reality, Chloe, grinding out a living in Chicago, slowly learning the value of her own labor, Mark, adrift and forgotten, and Arthur, whose foresight and courage had set all of these gears into motion. Arthur was right. Time reveals everything. It reveals the cheap metal, the weak connections, the forced alignments, but it also reveals the strength of the core. For 31 years, I had allowed other people to tell me what my value was. I had allowed them to treat me like a flawed component, an embarrassment to be hidden away. But sitting in the quiet sunroom, listening to the heartbeat of the restored chronometer, I finally understood the truth. I was never the anchor. I was the engine.